Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on the geopolitical implications of the war in Ukraine. My name is Philipp Genschel. I'm a professor of political science here at European University Institute. It's my pleasure to co-chair this seminar together with Stephanie Hoffmann, who is also a professor here at the UI. Now, the war has been going on for roughly 8 weeks now. The focus of most reporting and analysis has been on the main protagonists, on Russia, on the Ukraine, and on the West, which usually means the United States, NATO, the EU, and some major West European capitals, Berlin, Paris, London. But obviously, the war has implications far beyond this narrow circle of countries and actors. In this webinar, we focus on the effects of the war on the rest of the world, or at least in some parts of the rest of the world, more specifically China, Africa, and Eastern Europe. Let me introduce our three panelists. First, we have Xymena Kurowska. She's a professor of international relations at the Central European University still in Budapest, but in the future in Vienna. She has worked on Russia, Russian foreign policy, and cyber diplomacy. Today, she will fill us in on Eastern Europe. Next is Matthew Stephen. He is a research fellow at the Veit Berlin and the principal investigator of a project on China's bid for hegemony. He has also worked on India, Brazil, and South Africa in the past. Finally, I would like to welcome Alex Veit. He's a research fellow at the University of Bremen and currently directs a project on social policy in Africa. Thank you to all three panelists for joining. Before Stephanie starts us off, very difficult, with the first question here, some housekeeping rules. Please keep your microphones muted, but perhaps keep your camera on if possible to give us the feeling that we do have an audience. If you want to ask a question in the Q&A session, please use the Zoom raise hand function. Stephanie and I will make a heroic effort to take all questions in the right order, but can't give any guarantees. Finally, be aware that this webinar will be recorded. So if you don't like to see yourself recorded, you have to switch off your camera. Stephanie, is there anything else? Otherwise, let's get started.
Super, thank you, Philip, and a warm welcome from my side as well. So let me start maybe with our first question, and I might ask you, Xymena, to first address the question of how actually the war has affected countries in Eastern Europe and how these countries have reacted. I mean, you live in Hungary, you are Polish, so I'm pretty sure you have lots to share with us.
Thank you very much, Stephanie and Philip as well, for having me here. Two, let's say, qualifications before I start. So I am personally in Budapest, indeed, but my institution is officially in Austria. And I am making a point by kind of emphasizing this, and that's why the description on my screen as well. And the second qualification will be a little bit about confounding this category of Eastern Europe. And I'll start by saying that geographically speaking, there are many claimants to kind of where the center of Europe is, for instance, geographically. And it ranges from Slovakia to Hungary to and Poland as well, and Estonia and Lithuania, but also Ukraine has a claim of having the geographical center of Europe. And I understand, of course, that today we are going to be talking much more about geopolitical imageries rather than geographical facts, but still. So I I will say a few words about Central Europe, mainly about Hungary, because this is where I am personally, physically based indeed. But I should emphasize that the way the region reacted is not homogeneous at all. The region of Central Europe, how the war has been interpreted. But certainly Hungary stands out. Hungary stands out because it seems to be that even though there is a clear statement that Hungary indeed allies with all EU's estimation and assessment of the events, there is quite a lot of pushback in terms of what kind of sanctions they will be able to associate themselves with. And so I have a few notes I would like to share indeed. So Budapest has supported EU sanctions, condemned Russia's war, but Hungary refused to aid Ukraine with weapons. They refused to have their territory used to transport and deliver weapons. And the government has also opposed any EU sanctions on Russian oil and gas or, again, Western shipments. And there has been quite a wild exchange between President Zelensky and President Orban Viktor, rhetorically speaking, in terms of how they see each other and what they are doing. And I'll try to get back to this as well. Importantly, there has been also exchanges between foreign ministers of Ukraine and Hungary. So the Hungary's foreign minister, who was, by the way, awarded a Medal of Friendship from Vladimirovich Putin, actually summoned Ukraine's ambassador to say that it's, and I quote, "It's time for Ukrainian leaders to stop insulting Hungary and to take note of the will of the Hungarian people." The Ukrainian foreign minister said that the Hungary's readiness to pay for gas in ruble will be seen as an unfriendly act. But I think many have noted the most kind of glamorous statement by President Zelensky when he summoned President Orban to declare whether he is with us on the side of the so-called civilization or whether he's with Vladimirovich Putin. I have a few points I would like to make in terms of the context within which these statements are possible and this kind of rhetoric. And there is also on the media, there is quite a lot of anti-Ukraine, one could say, rhetoric. So I would like to make a few points how it is actually possible. So economic interests are really crucial. We have, there is a distinct centralization of economic power in the state of Hungary. And we have heard quite a lot of allegation on the part of the European Union of possible inaccuracies, so to say. I think there is no doubt we can also possibly think of the same allegiances and the same allegation in terms of Hungary and Russia economic resources. It's quite clear now also, and I have been part of this unfortunately, that offshore legal firms are getting more and more active in Hungary and looking for ways in which the so-called politically exposed persons, so in this case, the code word for people trying to alleviate the effect of international sanctions, to what extent their kind of operations and their life can be, let's say, easier in Hungary because of how Hungary can possibly approach the implementation of the sanctions. And yeah, I've heard a couple of jokes circulating that Budapest can become Budagrad, or let's say a little Londongrad, because the approach to oligarchs and Russian kleptocracy in London has changed, so they might flee. I'm not sure if investigative journalism is still possible in practice in Hungary. I just don't know. If it is, maybe we will hear more about it. So there is, the economic interests are very crucial, and in the rhetoric, they are framed as making sure that Hungarian households will have access to cheap gas, but there is much more behind that. There is also something that used to feature a lot in news, but I think is in the background at the moment, namely the very difficult Hungarian-Ukrainian relations from before the war, connected to the Hungarian minority in Ukraine. So Hungary has a very robust policy of protecting linguistic and cultural minorities that found themselves outside of historically ever-shrinking Hungary. And it has its own policy of passportization, to use a sort of a Soviet and Russian also term. It includes Ukraine. And in 2017, Ukraine introduced a very distinct educational law according to which Ukrainian language is the required language of primary education in state schools from grade 5. And this has become a situation around which the relations have worsened very distinctively. And before the war, Hungary has consistently argued against Ukraine's attempts to integrate with EU and NATO. So there is a kind of pre-story to this. And now with the announcement of the elections results, which I think we all know, Kovács Zoltán, who's in charge of the international strategic communication for the government, he officially thanked on Twitter the members of the Transcarpathian minority for their support and for their votes. So there is also this, and then there is this third point that I would make as a kind of condition of this unfriendly rhetoric, namely very different populist styles when you compare Zelensky and Orban. Arguably, both are populists. I'm not a specialist, I'm not an expert on populism, but still I think this argument can be made. But there is a clash here of different types of performances or different forms of populism. One is based, if I may, Zelensky's style is based on a more kind of egalitarian ideas and irreverence towards authority and dominance, social dominance, kind of Ernesto Laclau sort of populism, whereas Orban's is based on acquiescence to authority, a kind of take a bow sort of populism. And you can see it quite clearly in the way they exchange between themselves. Orban also repeated on a number of occasions that the core of Zelensky's appeal are his comedian skills. So it can be taken as a joke, but still. So in this context now recently, Orban Viktor trying to become a mediator, so to say, and making Budapest a place of next round of peace talks is a bit, of course, it's a sensitive issue. Also, historically speaking, Budapest in 1994 was a place where Budapest Memorandum was signed. That was a kind of OSCE mediated memorandum, according to which Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, they were giving up their nuclear status, were receiving security guarantees of UK and US and Russia in exchange, but they were also part of the memorandum. Budapest Memorandum is a significant reduction in arms reduction on the part of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. And I've also heard from a number of Ukrainian militaries that the rockets and that they gave up in accordance with the Budapest Memorandum, are now literally landing on their soil. So the key question is here, to what extent, after the elections as well, Orban Viktor will kind of correct or adjust, because altogether the statement is that we certainly align with the European Union and the sanctions, and we also we will not break out of Europe's common position on this matter, but we will see how it goes. Technically, I'm hearing that Hungarian diplomats are actually not breaking out in the actual kind of working groups, and when it comes to drafting concrete documents, they are very much aligning with the EU position, but their rhetoric is perhaps something else. I may say something about Poland, but as you wish. Oh, it's too much already.
Very, very briefly, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, Poland's response, I'll make a bad joke here by saying that Poland awaits a tactical nuclear attack. And I think I can make this bad joke because I have a Polish passport and Polish socialization into a geopolitical imagery, so to say. But yeah, Poland's reaction has been very dramatic, but also quite chaotic. And perhaps I shouldn't describe it like this in public, but perhaps also slightly problematic in diplomatic terms. You might have heard there was this sort of kerfuffle whether Poland should give the MiG-29, so fighter jets, to Ukraine or not, and we cannot give them to Ukraine directly because we have intelligence that Russia will then retaliate with this tactical nuclear attack. So we will give it to NATO, and NATO will give it to Ukraine, and so on and so forth. This was obviously quite badly prepared. Diplomatically. There is politically, there is a little bit of a narrative on the Polish side that we have told you so. We've always been telling you this is how it is, and this has happened. So there is a little bit of that. And on the societal side, there is this peak of, let's say, humanitarian sensibility, which can be seen in different ways, because we have a huge paradox on EU's eastern border at the moment when we compare the Poland's border with Belarus and Ukraine. The border with Belarus is closed, refugees cannot go through, and solidarity or help to refugees that come through the Belarusian border is literally criminalized, whereas the Polish-Ukrainian border is open. I mean, there is quite a lot of thought that could be given to this, of course. And there is a huge, but this is not my terrain, but there's a huge critique of the German position of the matter in the Polish political discourse. So that's briefly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Xymena. Thank you so much for walking us through what's going on in Hungary and Poland at the moment, and also for reminding us exactly that these denominators, Eastern, Central, or European, and just European in and of itself, are always geopolitical imaginaries. Very important to remember. Matthew, if I might now address you. I mean, you work on China's foreign policy and international politics, and we will talk about international organizations and how China has maneuvered in these organizations in the next set of questions. But I was wondering whether you can first talk a bit about what's going on in China since the war broke out. I'm not sure, maybe you also want to address the China-Taiwan issue, but we'd be curious to hear from you. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, for the invitation. And thank you also to Xymena for those comments on Europe, east of where I'm sitting. And we see a lot of the Ukrainian refugees who come through Poland from Warsaw also take the train journey here to Berlin, and I see them every day lining up at the town hall where I live to register here. So it's also, it's a personalized topic that we're talking about, also when we're thinking about it in these global terms. I guess, I try to be brief in my comments. I think from the perspective sitting here in Berlin, it's easy to get the impression that Russia has completely isolated itself, on the global stage in launching this war of aggression against Ukraine. But of course, when we take the more global perspective, the picture is a lot more differentiated, and it's a lot more complicated than that. And China is probably the clearest case. Russia has, of course, in the last 10 to 15 years, really been a driving force behind trying to institutionalize relationships to the emerging powers, right? To the emerging countries like like India and China, Brazil, South Africa. Russia has been driving this discourse of multipolarity and the idea of Western decline, and seeking to institutionalize its cooperation with the other BRICS states. And the other BRICS states have all reacted in different ways to Russia's war on Ukraine. And I would probably place them on a spectrum. And China would really be at one end of that spectrum. But even China is, I think, dancing a very delicate balancing act. Because on the one hand, China has been pursuing a strategic partnership with Russia for many years, which also predates Xi Jinping. And I think China also wants to maintain that special relationship to Russia, to maintain a strategic partnership. And it's also quite plausible that one of the frames by which the Chinese government interprets what is happening between Russia and Ukraine and the West is indeed with regard to Taiwan and the potential for a conflict to emerge between China and Taiwan, and what would be the situation if this happened, in which case Russian support would be potentially quite valuable to China. So I think this is one prism by which China is looking at this and has reacted to it. But the other side of the balance is, of course, I don't think anybody really knows how informed the Chinese government was by the Russian side about what steps Russia would take. I think this war, like most wars, at least the immediate cause of it, is related to some kind of miscalculation and a misunderstanding of the scenario. I think Putin has really misunderstood and miscalculated in what would happen. So I suspect that misunderstanding or that uncertainty was also shared by the Chinese side. So I don't think that the Chinese side was prepared for this. And I'm not convinced that the Chinese side is particularly happy about this, especially when this has the potential to endanger China's economic situation and the economic relationship to the West, on which China is really still very deeply integrated. So I think China is pursuing this balancing act. It was, with regard to international organizations, maybe we talk about that a bit more later on, but China was the only BRICS country to vote against kicking Russia out of the Human Rights Council just now. So China is covering for Russia in a way that the other countries are not. But I think China is still being very careful and restrained in a way so not to provoke, the full attention of the West, because if this happens, I think this would be quite a disaster for China and for the Chinese leadership. So this is what they're trying to avoid.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for sharing these insights with us. Alex, So, I mean, the African continent has over 50 countries. I don't expect you to talk about all of them, obviously, and you work mostly on Southern and Eastern Africa, if I read this correctly. So I'm just wondering whether you could tell us a bit about how some African states that you're more familiar with have reacted to the war, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, especially given that, I mean, various African countries have strong ties to Russia that even date to Soviet times. Please.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously the African picture is rather diverse given the huge number of countries, which are also very different in terms of how they relate to different foreign powers, great powers. Also, the impact, of course, is much more indirect. So this is much more at a distance compared to Hungary and Poland, obviously. Or even China. But I mean, some governments quickly condemned the Russian invasion. You may have heard this historical speech, historical in both ways, like it was referring to history, but it was somehow also historical because it gathered a lot of attention by the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations, who presented the African example of, okay, we stick with our colonial borders, but then we seek African unity, which is also has been the name of the African regional organization before. So this is kind of one, I don't know, maybe kind of voluntaristic reaction to this. There are other countries like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which I studied quite a lot, where the government has been, because it is internally very weak, the president has for a longer time already thought external support, both from neighboring countries, but also from the US in particular. So they also voted always against Russia in all the General Assembly votes. So, but I think that's mostly opportunistic, so they don't have any stakes in this, but it's also kind of a long-standing Syrian Congolese tradition to vote with the United States and see if they can get anything out of this, this kind of bandwagoning. There are few countries that came openly out in support of Russia, most clearly, obviously, Eritrea, though they don't have anything to lose in relationship with the West. So this is a pariah state anyway. In the vote yesterday on the Human Rights Council, it was notable that countries where there are Russian mercenaries working with the government, they voted against the expelling Russia from the Human Rights Council, so the Central African Republic, Libya, also Mali, and a couple of other countries. But I think that the largest group, and this has been very obvious in the vote yesterday in the General Assembly, the largest group is hedging. So I did this little count here by hand. I'm not sure if it's fully accurate, but I thought, but what I counted was that there were 8 countries voting to kick out Russia of the Human Rights Council, 7 that voted against this, but there have been 24 abstentions and 10 countries did not show up. So 34 countries decided to hedge kind of in this and kind of to, well, take a neutral stance, which is also an African diplomatic tradition. So the non-aligned movement has had many African members. And so this is kind of the idea, I think, to kind of keep themselves out. This is most obviously done by South Africa, which is arguing, the government is arguing that they want to keep the doors open for mediation. In South Africa itself, there's a liberal opposition camp, which is siding with the West and is criticizing the ANC government for being too friendly with Russia. For example, by pointing out that the important ministers showed up in a reception at the Russian embassy in Pretoria right when the war started. But there's also a left populist, I'm not really sure if it's really left. It's not progressive in any case, but it's a populist left, so to say, which is strongly anti-West, pro-Russian. So the government has kind of opposition from these two sides. So they somehow decide also to stay neutral in this regard. So this is South Africa's position here. I think generally, from an African perspective, of course, the war in Ukraine is not as important as it is for Europe, obviously. So it's just another war, really. So this, one may argue that the Russian aggression is kind of endangering the sovereignty of smaller states with a weak military. But then for African governments, they have always lived with the threat of intervention in one way or the other by non-African great powers. So all kinds of intervention, of course, from the colonial era, but also during the Cold War, this has been an everyday reality, and in the post-Cold War era as well, when you look at all the United Nations interventions. So it's always been an infringement of their sovereignty. And I think this voting on the United Nations level, this has always been for many African countries the one arena where they could proudly show that they are sovereign countries on an equal level with other states. And this is why they would very often vote in a way that kind of manifests this independence, this relative independence, which is not a sovereignty and independence that is real in economic terms, also not in other political terms, where African countries always are in a position of weakness in regards to external actors. And maybe a last word here. There's a lot of skepticism towards the West, and the whole position of Western countries, this unified front now, is understood as kind of self-interested rather than based on principles, because this is kind of the general impression from African governments, but also from much of the population, I'd say, that the West is not truthful. There's a lot of hypocrisy in the international politics of Western countries, and there are no principles. There are a lot of principle statements and moral lectures, but in the end, the West doesn't live up to the moral principles that it proclaims itself. Like the last example would be the problem of getting COVID vaccinations to African countries who did not receive their fair share. The patents would not be lifted on the vaccination production and so on. So African states felt left out. So in a way, this reaction is probably also a possibility now to show to the West that, well, you don't care so much about us, why should we care about your problem? And this is your problem, not ours.
Thank you also very much to you. Philip, please.
Yes, Alex basically already introduced the next set of questions on international organizations. Now, Matthew, you already mentioned how China voted in the UN General Assembly. So it abstained when the vote was on the condemnation of the war, but it voted against throwing Russia out of the Human Rights Council. Now, how important is the UN arena for China as a foreign policy arena in the context of this war?
I mean, I think it's pretty important. I think it is significant. You know, despite all of the hypocrisy that we might see on Western side, obviously, there's hypocrisy. There's enough hypocrisy to go around. And you know, one of the core principles that China has always emphasized, together with Russia, is that international order should be based on international law, the United Nations Charter, and the UN Security Council. So I think it is pretty significant. I think since China took over, since the People's Republic took over China's seat in the Security Council, this has become really critical for China's engagement with the world. But it's also interesting because there have now been 3 emergency sessions in the General Assembly. And China's voting, you can interpret it in different ways because abstentions, there's a lot of wiggle room to interpret what does this abstention mean depending on the context. And there's a bit of debate about that in the literature too. But I think a lot of people saw it as quite meaningful in the first resolution about, which was called like aggression against Ukraine, and it was about denouncing Russia, that China actually abstained. It didn't vote against it. The story probably would have been different in the Security Council, where the veto is more important, and Russia and China have a closer relationship to cover each other when it gets serious. But I think in this instance, this was quite significant that China actually abstained. And I think it did it again. It abstained in the second emergency session, which was again just sort of a statement denouncing Russia's actions. But when it actually comes to taking steps that have a real impact, of course, there's limits to what the Human Rights Council can do. But when it actually has an effect like suspending Russia's membership, then China draws a line. And I think it is also interesting because China pays, I think, a reputational cost for that amongst many countries and the publics of many countries. And I think they're aware of this. They're aware of this reputational cost that they end up in this list together with, Zimbabwe and Venezuela and North Korea. But then again, there are other issues where the United States is also, down on the list with a very small group of countries when it vetoes, some resolutions and so on. So this is nothing unique.
Thank you, Matthew. Alex, you already talked about African voting behavior in the United Nations. What about the African Union? Does the African Union take any position of this war, or are there other regional organizations where Africa has an opinion on this?
Well, the African Union is obviously without a unified position because the member states are so diverse. So there are some in this camp, some in the other, and most are neutral. So there have been, at the beginning of the war, there have been a few statements by the head of the Secretariat and by the head of the African Union, which is presently the Senegalese president. And they condemned Russia, but not in the name of the organization itself, but kind of in their own capacity. And there has been no vote in the African Union or anything on this question. What they came out strongly about is the treatment of Africans and African students at the border between Ukraine and Poland, and the different behavior, the different treatment for Ukrainian citizens and African citizens. And so they condemned this strongly. And this has been another example that kind of solidifies this impression that the Western states are hypocritical. So they proclaim human rights, but then they treat people differently in the same situation. Why? So, so this has been this is the one point I think where everybody could agree upon. So the African Union is not an obvious candidate to in any way play a role in this. And also, as far as I know, I'm not fully aware what ECOWAS is doing in West Africa, but the SADC countries, so the Southern African countries, they are most unified in their in this neutral stance, in this rather, let's keep the doors open. Let's maybe open the door for diplomacy and not openly criticize Russia, but also these organizations, they are they have enough to do with their own problems. Let's put it like that. So they are probably not involving them a lot. themselves a lot. What is important for African countries, of course, is the question of the economic repercussions, in particular in terms of imports of fertilizer and corn, of wheat from Russia and Ukraine. So this is a near continental topic, and it probably would also be a chance for Western countries to kind of bring African countries into their camp, but I'm sure they're going to fail it because that would cost some money. But also this is not an obvious area for the African Union, and already there has been a pledging conference organized by the FAO, so by a UN organization. And it's also a topic which is more problematic for those countries, in particular in North Africa, where a lot of wheat is consumed actually. So Egypt, for example, Tunisia, whereas in many other countries, this is not a staple food, or it's only the staple food for elites, people who can afford this. So this is not, the wheat problem is, I think, well, a little bit out of proportion in the media. The fertilizer problem seems to be much more difficult, but I didn't see, so the African farmers need a lot of fertilizer because in many countries the soil is not very fertile. So that would be a topic, but and especially also because many countries probably think of somehow circumventing the sanctions and getting the fertilizer into their country, but there's also the fear of being then punished by the United States and the European Union at the same time. So this is kind of, the expectation is, well, the poor will lose out here and we won't be helped by anybody. So somehow kind of try our chances, hedge in the situation and make the best out of it.
Thank you. Finally, let me turn to Xymena and ask you about the Vishagrad Group, which is interesting because Hungary and Poland are both part of it. What I find so striking and frankly don't quite understand is why Poland and Hungary differ so much in their approach to Russia. So what explains that? And how is that negotiated, if at all, at the regional level?
The difference is in history and geopolitical imaginary, again, I think mainly. But to be more precise, indeed, I mean, the Visegrad Four, so Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Czechia, they have a history of the organization itself has a bumpy history. Sometimes it was initially constructed in order to somehow facilitate the integration of these four countries into the European Union, and over time it has also become a means of lobbying within the European Union for the interests of these four. But the Visegrad Four, they have had some issues recently also over the Polish-Hungarian alliance against Brussels. The alliance was very clear because they are both in trouble over rule of law violation. So the alliance was really indeed quite strong. The difference really comes, I'm finding myself going back to the same spot today, but the difference is indeed that there seems not to have been the same level of the perception of Russia as a direct threat in Hungary the way it is in Poland. I mean, historically, Russia as a threat is a very important kind of rally around the flag situation in Poland, and even if those two governments are otherwise, let's say, politically quite aligned in terms of political values, if they are aligned in terms of how they want to fight Brussels. This is quite explicitly in the discourses. Ultimately, the geopolitics differs very much. So the expectation is that they will come to some sort of working relationship, Poland and Hungary, again because they are united against Brussels, that with the rule of law conditionality and so on and so forth. But this is a major crack, and actually for a lot of political opponents, that's I think an opportunity to also play on this difference. So yeah, to be kind of short, again. The difference is how Russia as a threat is perceived. Like in Poland, there's really this discourse of we can be attacked overnight. And it is a kind of real in the societal perception, so to say. And historically very kind of, very sensitive. I have a few things to say about UN as well, but don't have to follow up now.
Okay, why, if you want to say them now, say them.
Yeah, because
briefly.
We've started this a discourse on the West self-subversion in the UN as well. So basically not delivering on the proclaimed values, and therefore being an easy kind of, then it's easy to accuse of being hypocritical and really tangibly being so. What is, I think, quite important for the politics and diplomacy at the UN is that there is indeed, Russia has been part of this anti kind of Western discourse. What is not maybe immediately understood is that Russia understands itself as a real kind of opponent of the West and resistor of Western kind of dominant US-led dominance, right? So as difficult as it might be to kind of reconcile within one frame, we can say that Ukraine is fighting Russian imperialism, but Russia believes that it also fights US Western imperialism within the kind of the same, and Ukraine is only kind of basically a pawn in this game, and this is very tangible in UN politics, I think. And until now, my observation has been that Russia has been indeed capitalizing on anti-Western sentiments. To what extent this will continue, we'll see. Because if you also if you've seen Nebenzia, so the Russian permanent representative in the last days, the way Russia kind of speaks and waves its tail is more increasingly autopoietic. It is a kind of very little interaction and quite a lot of ritual and enactment of hostility towards the West.
Thank you. But, you know, isn't it a bit surprising? Isn't the Russian self-understanding still that of a European country? And wouldn't that make it part of the West?
This is, yeah, I mean, that's part of this complexity. It's a stigmatized European country, which is almost European, but not recognized as such. So that's kind of the core of the resentment that is very much present in the Russian discourse. Vyacheslav Molotov, a Russian scholar based in Estonia, has written quite a lot on Russia as a subaltern empire that is indeed dominating its neighbors, but cannot quite find its place as the right great power. There is a line also circulating that this war is actually a war of offended self-love and misrecognition, and not kind of embracing Russia indeed as the great power. So yeah, there are also these opinions.
Thank you. Stephanie.
So I see there are already quite a few questions who have trickled in. Please keep on going, either write them in the chat box or later just raise your hand and ask them. But there's one more question we would like to address to our roundtable participants before we open the floor. And that's our crystal ball question. So, I mean, sorry, but if you can find your crystal ball now, that would be great. So we talked about what's going on the country level, what's going on the IO level. And now we'd like to just address briefly what you see happening on what we could call world ordering, right? What's happening on this global order level. You all pointed to variegated reactions from different countries when it comes to the war. Some want to isolate Russia, others want to keep engaging with Russia as before, and others again are very selective in the way they are right now engaging with Russia. So the question really is, what kind of geopolitical implications you're observing? So I'm asking this very broad question to the three of you, and Alex, if you don't mind to start us off with this question.
Well, my predictive capabilities are a little bit limited. But I mean, I think that there's gonna be a new polarization has been obvious already before the war from the African perspective. But maybe it doesn't have to, it wasn't expected to be so, well, put it like hot. Maybe it was more expected to be more kind of a competition rather than open armed conflict, right? So, of course, there has been a lot of Chinese activity in Africa, obviously, with a lot of money. But also other would-be great powers did invest a lot in the last 10 or 20 years, like Turkey, but also the oil-rich Middle East countries engaged a lot. And also Russia. All of them have been invited to come to Africa in the kind of the old tradition of everybody's welcome, bring your good things into our countries. Russia, of course, played, I think, the least important role. So Russia was kind of the friend of last resort. So if you don't have any other friends left in the world out there, there's still Russia. So they will bring in the mercenaries and defend your regime if there's nobody else lending your hand anymore. So this kind of the demise of Russia is probably less of a problem for most African states, except for Central African Republic, for example. There are also new advances by the European Union, great promises, as always. A lot of money to be invested into African infrastructure after China invested already into African infrastructure, but obviously African governments will take this with a grain of salt because there have been many great promises in the past. So most governments probably perceive this as a good position for weak countries because they are able to negotiate with external powers for the terms of their engagement with them. At the same time, of course, there's a high risk that kind of this hot conflict in Ukraine as a proxy war could also take place in African countries. So there's also this risk, but as always, African governments will probably try to be flexible and react to the situation rather than having kind of great strategies.
Xymena, what does your crystal ball say?
There's the saying in Slavic languages and certainly in Russian that we are in the middle of the sentence, which means that we are writing it. So that's my crystal ball. But to share my thought, I mean, maybe it's important to recognize that we are certainly at war. Because sanctions, the way they have been applied as a punishment, well, can be interpreted as a form of war. I think it's also useful to recognize that this is a war of a dying empire. So can we, maybe historically speaking, also think back on what analogies perhaps, or yeah, what cases we can think of that can help us make sense of what happens to a dying empire. It's very bloody. So I think the war will continue, even if, let's say, its active phase may kind of fluctuate, may stop for now. A lot of people say that there may be a ceasefire, but the peace will not come. And what kind of space Ukraine then becomes, of course, as a sovereign country, hopefully, but it will be this way or another, a militarized country that needs to kind of think of the possibility of war as a constant, not something, not that peace can be achieved. For me, and I started talking about it in terms of geopolitical consequences. I started already talking about it when I mentioned this politics, UN politics. What I'm a little bit afraid of is that this discreditation of what Russia has been quite involved in discreditation of democratization of international politics, because it capitalized on this anti-Western discourse, but it was ultimately self-serving in order to, again, that was democratization among great powers. It was not democratization more broadly, but by kind of consistently and constantly preying on this discourse, I think it has discredited quite a lot of discourse. So in this sense, I think in the longer run, but this is speaking from the sentence that is being written, I think we might be back to some sort of unipolarity, even if I don't necessarily want to use this vocabulary. Thank you.
Thank you. And by the way, there are two questions in the chat addressed to you. You might want to read them. Matthew, how does it look like from the Chinese perspective? What do you think will the future bring in terms of geopolitical implications of the war?
I mean, I'm not the one to ask for the Chinese perspective exactly, but I think China will play an important role in how this develops. I mean, from my perspective, I think there are two, I mean, not to get too crystal ball-y, but I think there are two big changes that are taking place already now. And if they continue, I think this would have quite an important impact on, world order. And the first is this renaissance of Cold War style thinking, which has emerged in the last years in the United States. I mean, Joe Biden has already hosted the first of his summits for democracy, and the framing of international politics in terms of a fight between democracies and autocracies, or between democracy and dictatorship. I think this has really emerged again in a very strong way, not just amongst politicians, also in academia. We see this coming back quite strongly. And, we look at the institutions. What is probably the biggest institutional winner from this conflict? NATO. NATO is back, right? And so this Cold War kind of thing, exactly what the Chinese government has always been criticizing and has been fearing, is exactly what is happening. So that's the first one. And the second one that I would highlight is essentially the end of an era of liberal free trade globalization. The kind of basic assumption about how the world economy works. As I was growing up, when I was a kid, Bill Clinton in charge, liberal globalization, World Trade Organization, and so on. I think this is over. I mean, we now have an economic war taking place between the West and Russia. A really fundamental sanctions regime, which will probably be extended to gas and oil somehow. I think in the near future, which is really basically strangling the Russian economy. In addition to the trade war between the United States and China, which Trump initiated, which hasn't gone away. Now there's a really fundamental reevaluation in Europe and around the world about vulnerability to shocks, from COVID, global value chains, should be, onshore production more, and so on. So I think, this is the second thing, this end of a kind of liberal, free trade, globalization era. I think this is the second big change which I see happening now.
Thank you, Matthew. I think we should open the Q&A session. I already see questions from the audience, but let me start with two questions from the chat. So Robert had a question on the meaning of Orban's victory in Hungary. Does it mean that the Hungarian public agrees with his foreign policy views, or does it simply mean that the war didn't figure in the election campaign? And Bernhard wanted to know if any of you can talk about the World Council of Churches, and more specifically, the reactions of religious leaders from different Orthodox churches, for instance, or also from the Catholic Church. So are there any volunteers? Xymena, the first question was addressed to you, definitely.
Yes, and without being a great expert on Hungarian politics, I can say that the war did feature in the election campaign, but it featured also in terms of values. But the predominant narrative of Orbán Viktor government was that we will not send our Hungarian sons to battle, and we need cheap gas for households. And I think this, to provide a short answer, the effect was that, that for the time being is the priority of the Hungarian public, whereas for Poland and Czechia, the discourse was very different, and we don't have elections at the moment, right? But in Poland, again, Russia as a threat has been part both of the government, but also societal threat. And in Czechia, we have also seen that there has been perhaps a greater diversity, but we have seen that the Czech society very much kind of affiliates with this idea of Russia as a threat, and the elites have been maybe containing, but now they have changed their position, and they are ready for tank delivery. So yeah, in Hungary, that I think priorities are at the moment different. I'm not very competent to answer about the World Council of Churches. However, we have seen from the Pope a very straightforward condemnation of the war. He even indicated that he might travel. There is, from what I understand, quite a lot of disagreement within the Orthodox Church. So there is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. And the Russian Orthodox Church, from what I understand, I don't want to kind of mislead anyone, but from what I understand, the Russian Orthodox Church did, let's say, support the Russian war operation. And
thank you. Bernhard just informed us on the chat that he's prepared to answer his own question. Bernhard.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, fine.
Hello, yes, I'm sitting here in Frankfurt am Main, and I have been terribly interested in other international organizations, and hence the World Council of Churches as one of them. What I find interesting is the way in which, yes, as was pointed out just now, the different Orthodox churches have taken different stands, and some of those stands have been related to the way in which those Orthodox churches took a stand on the autocephaly self-government of the Ukrainian church dating back to 2018. I might add that actually I'm an economist, but I'm also a student of antiquity, and hence I'm rather interested in the politics of the old churches. But that's how I come to this. It is interesting to see how the different Orthodox churches have either sided up directly or in fact have tended to shift their positions somewhat, so that, for instance, the Polish Orthodox Church has shifted its position towards somewhat much more of a pro-Ukrainian view. At least it is prepared to speak up, whereas in the past it tended to be very supportive of Russia and the Russian church, which has a very, very hard line on this issue. One can spot this in other churches. I'm not going to go through a list, but I have been looking at this. The other thing is the way in which, yes, the World Council of Churches does seem to have a role. The Pope sits there as one of the protagonists and one of the speakers. What is also interesting is that the Ukrainian church is not a member of the World Council of Churches, because Russia won't let it be one. And there are even discussions about whether one could actually eject the Russian Orthodox Church and let the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in. There's participation from a lot of people. I mean, one could see this from the Archbishop of Canterbury in the United Kingdom. And I'm interested in, as I say, these sort of alternative fora where possibly people are able to either reach out and seek agreements, or possibly even to intensify some of the debate. I put this as a question to you because it is something which I've been thinking about a lot in the last time. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. It is indeed very interesting. Next on our list is Adrienne.
I would like to raise 3 points, going back to the position of Hungary, because you stress that history plays a role in its attitude. But then the memory must be very short, because in 1956, I mean, that was the great shock for Hungary, the invasion of the Russians. So why didn't that play a role now in the recent weeks? And why did Hungary not go along with the 3 others from Central Europe, including the Polish, I think, foreign minister, went to Kiev? And the second point I want to make, just for, it's a bit maybe outside, but under which conditions, to Matthew, under which conditions have there been successful collective actions in the African Union?
I think this was more to Alex. Alex, you want to start, and then we go to...
Sorry.
No worries.
Sorry.
Sure. I'd like to start, but I didn't understand the question. There has been some... could you repeat it?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I would be curious under which conditions there have been successful collective actions of the African Union. In which context, under which conditions?
I see. Well, the African Union has been actively sending military interventions into some places, most notably Somalia. So on the African continent for some time, they have been able, with external support, external financial and also military support, to send peace troops to some countries. And also, but their big project right now is a African free trading zone. So this is kind of the major thing African Union is doing, but it's not externally active. So it's not trying to play a role in world politics or involve itself in a what is perceived as a European problem. That would probably be the next step then, if that free trading zone would work out and increase the economic activities in the way they like it.
Thanks, Mina. I think there was a question.
Yes, yes. This has been raised. So in terms of historical narratives and how come 1956, which is so strong otherwise in Hungarian societies, kind of conscious and unconscious, so to say, how come it did not play a role? So this has been raised by many analysts. But in the end, I think analytically speaking, we can say that history does not act as a kind of automatic variable, so to say. But more broadly, what we can say is that in this particular context, the very difficult relations between Hungary and Ukraine from before the war prevailed in terms of also why Orbán Viktor would not go to Kiev. It was a very strong statement of not supporting Ukraine, because from the fans of Polish politics, for instance, on the Polish side, it was not only the prime minister, but also Jarosław Kaczyński, who's actually it was not his place to go, but he's the head of the ruling party. So he went and he was a kind of an additional person there. I think the most important here in terms of the Kiev visit must have been this very strong animosity between Ukraine and Hungary from before the war. And yes, I would maybe put it like this, yeah.
Thank you very much. Next question is Jim, who already wrote his answer in the chat, but if you don't mind, Jim, could you please now ask it virtually?
Can y'all hear me? Can y'all hear me, please?
Yes, we can.
Yes. So just a quick background. I'm based in Frankfurt, and I serve EU Commission on two topics: the EU future COVID digital readiness, and last year, EU future vision of healthcare. So I'm here very concerned about the need for the war to end soon, because the longer the war continue, the higher the chance that we potentially get new COVID-19 variant coming up from the Ukraine. Imagine that people are in the basement car park and they are grouped together. And there's a lot of, and they are highly stressed. And there are no contingency for COVID tests. There are no contingency for refugee moving in and going back to Ukraine for checking their COVID status. So I want to raise this as a way to hopefully bring more people beside those countries that is hosting Ukraine refugee, but also other European countries understand that this could be also a COVID crisis that could potentially come from Ukraine. And the sooner we all work together and find a way to end this, the sooner we can avoid unnecessary future challenges to deal with, a potential new form of variant, right? So right now, US already, in some places, already started to implement masks. This thing come in wave. Right now, we are in Europe, we are in the wave of relaxation. We do not know what's coming ahead. So I just want to bring this so that we understand the urgency to solve Ukraine crisis, also for the sake of preventing us from getting into a worse situation in COVID. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, for sharing your thinking about this and reminding us that actually the crisis can be interconnected. As we just move from one to the next, actually the pandemic is still with us. Next up, Marius, please.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, everyone, for the very insightful comments. My question is about BRICS, and more specifically about coordination between powers which are said to be in disagreement or to challenge the order that the Western powers prefer. So what we have seen in reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine is basically that the European and North American powers and their allies around the world, like Australia, South Korea, Japan, have been able to coordinate a very strong response. When it comes to Russia and its partners or allies, we have not seen this. When it comes to BRICS, we have seen ambivalent responses from China, from Brazil, from South Africa, from India, limited responses in support of Russia. What does this tell us about the potential of an cooperation, an alliance, of call it however you want, between non-Western powers in a so-called competition over the rules and institutions of the international system? If we buy into the narrative that we are entering into a great power competition, then what we see during this conflict in Ukraine is basically that the West is united, while the non-Western powers who are said to be challenging the West-led order are not actually making a common front. They are not so much united. They may not challenge and openly reject the actions of Russia, but they are also not openly embracing them. So what does this tell us about the ability of those powers who we say, or at least the literature and practitioners say, are challenging the Western-led institutions and order to actually build a common project in this regard? Thank you.
Matthew, do you want to go at this question first? But I assume that maybe even Alex and Xymena can also address this question at a later stage. Is that okay, Matthew?
Yeah, that's great. And thank you, Marius. I think it's a really good question, and you already made a good point in your question. And I mean, my brief response is that you're right. The West on this issue is much more united than the BRICS on this issue. But there are other issues where the BRICS have worked more closely together, despite the differences that they clearly have. You know, when we look at things like multilateral organizations, if we look at the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, then the BRICS have more closely worked with each other to push for reforms that benefit themselves at the expense of Western countries. And we see it also in things like, you know, the new institutional initiatives that they have, like the New Development Bank and also the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So there are issues where they work together, but I think you're completely right. There are also big things dividing them, and we see it in a very kind of complicated triangular relationship between Russia, China, and India, where there's pretty low levels of trust on, you know, many of those parts of the relationship. And India, I think, is pretty strongly committed to having an independent, non-aligned, you know, approach, where it will try to work together with different countries in different contexts. So I think it is more, you know, complicated on the BRICS side than on the Western side. but that doesn't mean that they don't also have sort of certain projects that they have in common.
Thank you. I don't know, Alex or Xymena, do you also want to address the question about the BRICS? I mean, about Alex, you worked in South Africa. Xymena, you had a project on the BRICS, but don't feel obliged.
Yeah, my take on this is that why would we actually expect them to have a common front? I mean, that would be kind of more surprising that they did, because of precisely the significant differences between them. I mean, in terms of latest voting as well, it was only China that voted indeed in favor of suspending Russia in the Human Rights Council, and all the rest abstained. And this is in the realm of abstention. There is real politics, sometimes one can say. So yeah, they are extremely different, and they don't have a common front. They should not be expected to have a common front, I think, but they do have indeed very pragmatic coalitions when it is useful. I think we shouldn't assume that the rest is ideologically homogeneous, in other words.
Yeah, I do agree with everybody who spoke on this question right now. I mean, obviously, these countries are very different, the BRICS countries, and they have some common interests in economic terms. So the dominance of the US dollar is probably perceived even more as a problem now, as the Western states use this dominance now to undermine the Russian central bank. So there's an obvious joint interest of getting out of this dependency, but otherwise the BRICS countries do have very different interests, simply because their economies are really of a very different size, and they also exist in different regions of the world. So their foreign policy interests are very different. But I would also caution about the unification, new unification of the West. This is for the moment, and there will be new crises, and there will be another picture emerging. I'm, well, relatively sure.
Xymena, there's a two-finger.
Yeah, just to say that I very much agree with Alex. I think this kind of unity is just on the surface, and that can or does not have to relate to the question about the support for Ukraine's membership in the European Union and NATO, right? So the membership in NATO is off the table, that's for sure. But with the membership in the European Union, this is going to be very contested, I think, in the long run. Or Ukraine may end up in a Turkey's position, perhaps.
Definitely. Can I have a quick two-finger up? Thanks so much. Just
last round of two fingers.
I've got the fingers down already, but maybe just one thought on that. I mean, one sort of thought experiment is, of course, what Western unity would look like if Vladimir Putin had invaded Ukraine when Donald Trump was still president. What kind of situation would we have now? What kind of conversation would we be having? It's something to think about. That's all.
No, thank you very much for that. See, we have not only addressed crystal balls today, but we also talked about hypotheticals, which I think are worthwhile thinking through. Jim, your hand is up, but sorry, we're actually running out of time.
4 more minutes.
1 minute?
4 more. I mean, there's 4 more minutes left.
That is true. Like that.
Very quick.
Okay, please.
I just want to thank this organization or event, and I think we are now faced with Ukraine war. During COVID-19 war, only the frontline worker working in the hospital, scientists are able to make major contribution. But for Ukraine war, everybody, all professionals have a chance to make contribution, yeah, to fight for the war. And the other thing is we are still facing climate change. We are going to face with more pandemic war. And if Russia try to defrost those areas. We might have new other wars. So the important is using Ukraine war as a means unify humanity. People who are willing to take Ukraine refugee, they are from different country, different continent. These people represent a potential network of people with empathy and compassion. And Ukraine war provide an opportunity to unite all these people from different countries, and we need to seize this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Let me just add to this. I think that goes for any war that is going on, right? The Ukrainian war is actually not the only war that is occurring on this planet at the moment, and we should just hope for any human reaction to any war situation. I mean, Xymena mentioned that the border, the Belarusian-Polish border is close to Syrian and Afghan refugees, right? We should keep in mind that these are also situations of war where people are suffering. But thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Let me just thank everyone, first of all, of course, and our panelists who were kind enough to follow our invitation to do a virtual roundtable with us. Next time, hopefully, we'll see you in person in Florence. Thank you so much for attending and for sharing your insights and thoughts with us. It was very, very much appreciated. And thank you so very much to everyone else who came and listened and asked questions. I hope you enjoy these kind of roundtables where we just basically talk what's on top of our head, but given our expertise based on, like, we've done research, but then we also read the news and we share our insights, and these kind of roundtables are really there to share these kind of insights, not the research with the data that we engage with at other times. So thank you again. Have a good weekend, I hope, and see you at the next roundtable. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.